They had crossed 40 star systems without losing a single battle. They had shattered civilizations that had existed for 10,000 years. They had brought entire species to their knees. Species with faster ships, longer lifespans, and weapons that could split moons. And then, they found us. A small, wet rock orbiting an unremarkable star. A species that had only just learned to leave its own atmosphere. A species that still fought wars with chemical explosives and metal projectiles. By every known measure of galactic civilization, we were nothing. The Varick Dominion looked at humanity and saw easy prey. They were wrong, and by the time they understood that, there was no one left to report the mistake. In the year 2187, humanity made first contact. Not with one alien civilization, but with 47 of them. Simultaneously, because out here, beyond the edge of our solar system, the galaxy was already crowded. Already organized. Already governed, the galactic concord had existed for over 60,000 years. It was not a perfect union. It was a survival arrangement, species that had agreed, centuries ago, that coexistence was more efficient than endless war. Humanity was welcomed, cautiously, curiously, like a child allowed into a room full of adults. And among those who were contemptuous, none were more certain of humanity's insignificance than the Varick Dominion. The Varick had been the Concord's most feared military power for 3,000 years. They did not fight wars. They ended civilizations. And when they looked at Earth's primitive defense systems, their reaction was not aggression. It was amusement. At the 214th Concord Assembly, the Varick ambassador, High Commander Sorik Vel, delivered what would become the most consequential speech in galactic history. He did not threaten humanity. He dismissed us. The humans are an interesting specimen. Young, energetic, charmingly unaware of their own limitations. They have emotion where other species have strategy. They have loyalty where others have logic. They build monuments to their dead instead of learning from them. We have reviewed their military capability. Their largest warship would be outclassed by our patrol vessels. Their most advanced weapon is one we catalogued and surpassed 12 centuries ago. They are not a threat. They are not even an inconvenience. They are a curiosity. And like all curiosities, they will eventually bore us. The human delegation sat still. Admiral Yara Chen heard every word. She did not respond. She wrote 3 words in her personal log that evening. We will return to those words before this story ends. 6 months after the Concord Assembly, the Varick made their move. Not against Earth. That would come later, they assumed.
In 711 AD, a Berber Muslim general from North Africa, Tariq ibn Ziyad, led his army across the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain. Fun fact most people don't know, the name, Gibraltar, itself comes from Jabal al-Tariq, meaning Tariq's mountain. Tariq's army wasn't massive, somewhere between 7,000 and 12,000 soldiers. But his strategy was to exploit Spain's internal divisions. At the Battle of Guadalete, Tariq's forces dealt a devastating blow to King Roderick's army. Roderick himself either died in the battle or disappeared. Historians still disagree on exactly what happened to him. What followed this victory was something nobody expected. The entire Visigothic kingdom collapsed. In just 7 years, from 711 to 718 AD, Muslim forces had taken control of most of the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal. This was one of the fastest conquests in history. And the reason wasn't just military strength. It was also that several local groups, including oppressed Jewish communities and even some disillusioned Visigothic nobles, sided with the new rulers because they had so many grievances against the old regime. The advance was finally stopped at the Battle of Tours, 732 AD, in France, where Frankish leader Charles Martel halted the Muslim push northward. Had that battle gone differently, the map of Europe today might look completely different. The conquered territory was given a name. Al-Andalus. At first, it was part of the Umayyad Caliphate, ruled from Damascus. But in 750 AD, when the Abbasids overthrew the Umayyads and massacred most of the family, one surviving Umayyad prince, Abd al-Rahman I, fled all the way to Spain. There, he established his own independent state, the Emirate of Córdoba, 756 AD, completely separate from the Caliphate in the Middle East. This is where the true golden chapter of Al-Andalus begins. By the 10th century, Córdoba was one of the largest and most advanced cities in the entire world. Its population is estimated at around 500,000, at a time when cities like London and Paris were little more than small towns. What Córdoba had? Lit streets, while the rest of Europe's cities went pitch dark at night. Over 70 libraries, including a royal library said to hold more than 400,000 manuscripts. Running water and public bathhouses. Hospitals where trained doctors performed actual surgery. This wasn't just architectural grandeur, it was the center of an intellectual revolution. Convivencia, living together. One of the defining features of this era was the coexistence of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Historians call this period convivencia. This included Jewish scholars writing in Arabic and holding important positions in the caliph's court, like Hasdai ibn Shaprat. Christian and Muslim scholars working together to translate Greek philosophy into Arabic, knowledge that later made its way into Latin and reached the rest of Europe. Maimonides, the famous Jewish philosopher, was born right there in Córdoba. This wasn't a perfect utopia. Non-Muslims faced discrimination and special taxes, like the jizya, and tensions did flare up at times. But compared to the rest of Europe, where religious minorities were routinely burned alive, Al-Andalus was considered remarkably tolerant for its time. Science and knowledge. Scholars of Al-Andalus gave the world Al-Zooiii, the father of surgery, who invented over 200 surgical instruments that still form the basis of modern surgery today. Ibn Rushd Averroes, whose commentaries on Aristotle directly influenced Europe's Renaissance. Major advances in astronomy, mathematics, and agricultural techniques. The Great Mosque of Córdoba, today known as the Mezquita Catedral de Córdoba, was the era's greatest architectural achievement, and it still stands today, now a mosque-turned-cathedral. Note for video editor. Insert visuals of the Córdoba Mosque, the Alhambra Palace, and old maps of Al-Andalus. But like every golden age, this one didn't last forever. In 1031 AD, the Caliphate of Córdoba collapsed due to internal politics and succession crises. Al-Andalus broke apart into smaller independent states known as the Taifa kingdoms, Seville, Granada, Toledo, Zaragoza, and others. These kingdoms began fighting each other. And at times, a Muslim Taifa would even ally with a Christian kingdom against a rival Muslim Taifa. This division created a massive opportunity for the Christian kingdoms, and this is where the real momentum of the Reconquista begins. Reconquista means reconquest. It's the term used to describe the centuries-long effort by Christian kingdoms to, in their view, take back Spain. This process had actually begun just a few years after 711 AD. Small Christian kingdoms survived in the north, like Asturias, and gradually pushed southward, but it took centuries, not days. Key moments: 1085 AD, Toledo, a hugely important city, fell to Christian forces. 1147 AD, the Almoravids, a strict Berber dynasty from North Africa, replaced the weakened Taifa kingdoms and briefly consolidated Muslim power. 1212 AD, Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, this was the turning point. combined Christian forces decisively defeated the Almohad army, another North African dynasty. After this, Muslim power shrank rapidly. By the end of the 13th century, only one Muslim kingdom remained, the Emirate of Granada, ruled by the Nasrid dynasty. Granada survived because its mountainous terrain made it easy to defend. The Christian kingdoms, Castile and Aragon, were often busy fighting each other. Granada repeatedly paid tribute to Castile to buy peace. This is the same Granada where the Alhambra Palace was built, still Spain's most visited monument today, and a true masterpiece of Islamic architecture. Editor note: visuals of the Alhambra, illustration of the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. Segment 7, 1492, The Fall of Granada, 34:00 to 39:00. Now we reach the most dramatic moment in this entire story. In 1469, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile married, uniting two major Christian kingdoms. This union laid the foundation for what would become modern Spain. They decided Granada had to fall. After a 10-year campaign, the Granada War, 1482 to 1492, Christian forces took the kingdom city by city. Granada's last ruler was Muhammad XII, known to history as Boabdil. On January 2, 1492, Boabdil surrendered the keys of the Alhambra to Ferdinand and Isabella. Legend says that as Boabdil left Granada, he turned for one last look from a hilltop, a spot still known today as El Último Suspiro del Moro, the Moor's last sigh. 800 years of Muslim Spain, over. This is the same year Christopher Columbus reached the Americas. In a single year, 1492, Spain witnessed two events that would reshape world history. This is where the saddest chapter of this story begins. At the time of the surrender, Ferdinand and Isabella had promised that Muslims would be free to practice their religion, the Treaty of Granada. But that promise lasted only a few years. 1492, the expulsion of the Jews. First came the Alhambra Decree, forcing Spain's Jews to either convert or leave the country. Thousands of Jews left Spain, many finding refuge in the Ottoman Empire, where they were welcomed. 1499 to 1526, forced conversion of Muslims. At first, Muslims were granted some tolerance. But under the policies of Cardinal Cisneros, pressure to forcibly convert Muslims began. Arabic books were burned. Mosques were converted into churches. Muslims who converted came to be known as Moriscos, new Christians on paper, but never fully accepted by society. They were viewed with constant suspicion, on the assumption that their conversion was only outward, not sincere. The Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition, already active since 1478, originally targeting Jews, now turned its focus on the Moriscos as well. People were tortured to test the sincerity of their faith. Those caught secretly practicing their old religion faced severe punishment, sometimes execution. 1609 to 1614, the final expulsion of the Moriscos. The final and harshest blow came under King Philip III. In 1609, a decree ordered that all Moriscos, even those who had become Christian converts, be expelled from Spain. An estimated 300,000 or more people were forcibly loaded onto ships and sent to North Africa or Ottoman territories. Many died during the journey itself, some were robbed, others killed even as they were boarding. A community with 800 years of history in Spain, whose language, culture, architecture, and science had become woven into the fabric of the country, was almost entirely erased in just a few short years. If you visit Spain today, only the physical traces of Muslim Spain remain. The Alhambra Palace, Granada. The Mezquita of Córdoba. The Giralda Tower, Seville. Thousands of Arabic-origin words in the Spanish language, like azúcar, sugar, from azúcar, and aceite oil, from azizate. Agricultural techniques, like irrigation systems, still used in Spain today. But the people, the community that built all of this, no continuous descendant population remained in Spain. Their history survives only in monuments. It's a lesson history keeps repeating. No matter how advanced a civilization is, without unity, internal division can be all it takes for an outside force to bring it down. So that was the story of Al-Andalus. From 711 to 1614, the rise of a civilization, its golden age, and its heartbreaking end. This history doesn't just teach us one thing. It teaches us that power is never permanent. Even what looks strongest today can collapse under the weight of its own divisions. If you enjoyed this video, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments, do you think history tends to repeat itself? See you in the next video, with another story that's been hiding in the pages of history. Subscribe plus next video suggestion. The man responsible for the most infamous version of Valerian's fate was a Christian writer named Lactantius. To understand why his account reads the way it does, you need to understand who Lactantius was and what he wanted his readers to believe. Lactantius was born around the time Valerian was captured, and he grew up to become an advisor to Constantine. Yes, that Constantine, the emperor who would later make Christianity the favored religion of Rome. Lactantius wrote his major historical work decades after Valerian's death, and his agenda was not subtle. He was specifically interested in cataloging the deaths of Roman emperors who had persecuted Christians, and showing that they all met suitably horrible, divinely ordained ends. It's literally one of his book's central arguments. Persecute the Christians, and God will make sure you suffer for it. And Valerian fit that mold perfectly, because earlier in his reign, Valerian had issued edicts demanding that Christians, including clergy, perform sacrifices to the Roman gods, leading to real persecution and real executions, including some of the most famous Christian martyrs of the era. So when Lactantius sat down to write about how Valerian's life ended, he had every motivation in the world to make it sound as gruesome and humiliating as possible. A villain needs a suitably awful death scene. Valerian was, in Lactantius's narrative, the villain. Here is what Lactantius actually wrote, as closely as we can summarize the substance without quoting it word for word, that the Persian king, whenever he wished to mount his carriage or his horse, would command the captured Roman to bend down and offer his back as a step. Day after day, this routine of humiliation. The most powerful man in the Roman world, reduced to human furniture. And Lactantius doesn't stop there. He claims that Valerian, in his despair, tried to negotiate his own ransom, basically begging to be bought back. But according to this account, Valerian's own son, Gallienus, now sole emperor back in Rome, never even sent a formal demand for his father's return. Lactantius practically twists the knife on this point, painting a picture of an abandoned old man, humiliated daily, with his own child too consumed by other matters, or too embarrassed by his father's footstool status, to even try to get him back. Then comes the ending. According to this same tradition, Shapur eventually decided Valerian had outlived his usefulness as a living trophy. The accounts diverge slightly here into two equally horrifying versions. One says Shapur forced Valerian to drink molten gold, pouring liquid, superheated metal down the old emperor's throat as a final, gruesome execution, a method of death some listeners might recognize from later fictional retellings and fantasy shows, except this Roman version predates all of them by over 1,000 years. The other version says Valerian was flayed alive, skinned while still living, or immediately after death. And then, in either version, comes the detail that turned this from a brutal execution into a piece of psychological warfare that would echo for centuries. Shapur allegedly had Valerian's skin removed, dyed a deep, vivid red, and stuffed with straw to recreate the shape of a man. This grim trophy was then hung permanently in one of the most important temples in Persia. It became a kind of museum exhibit of Roman humiliation. Visiting Roman diplomats and ambassadors, sent to negotiate with Persia in later years, were reportedly maneuvered, practically tricked, into walking past this thing, forced to confront the literal skin of a former emperor of Rome hanging on a wall, a permanent reminder of what happens to those who challenge Persian power. One modern historian studying this account put it about as bluntly as you can. This was, in his words, the single greatest indignity that any Roman emperor had ever been forced to endure. Now pause here, because this is the moment in the story where we need to put on our detective hats. Does this story sound almost too perfectly designed to be propaganda? A villain who persecuted Christians, getting an appropriately monstrous comeuppance, written decades after the fact by an author with an explicit religious and political agenda? It should sound that way. Because that's exactly the suspicion that modern historians have had about this account for a very long time. Here's the single most important piece of evidence in this entire story, and it's not a written account at all. It's stone. While Lactantius was writing his version of events from a Roman and Christian perspective, Shapur was busy doing something Persian kings love to do, commissioning massive rock-cut monuments celebrating his own triumphs. These weren't quick sketches. They were enormous, deliberate, state-sponsored propaganda, carved by professional artisans into cliff faces meant to last for all of recorded history. And remarkably, they still survive today, in places like Nakshi, Rostam, and Bishapur in modern Iran. So what do Shapur's own monuments, the ones he commissioned to brag about his greatest victory, actually show? They show three Roman figures connected to his triumphs: the dead Emperor Gordian, trampled or fallen beneath Shapur's horse; the Emperor Philip, kneeling in submission; and Valerian, standing at Shapur's side while the Persian king grips him by the wrist. Notice what's missing. There is no footstool. There is no image of Valerian bent over as a human step. In every single surviving Persian carving, Valerian is shown fully clothed in his imperial robes, standing upright, not chained, not bound, not crouching in the dirt. He's depicted as a captive, absolutely. Gripped firmly by the wrist is unmistakably a gesture of domination and control, but it is a world apart from the image of an emperor as furniture. This is a genuinely strange contradiction once you think about it from Shapur's own perspective. If Valerian truly were being forced to act as a literal human footstool, daily, publicly, wouldn't that be exactly the kind of detail an ancient propagandist would want carved into a mountain forever? Shapur clearly wasn't shy about humiliating his Roman captives in stone. He was happy to show Philip groveling on his knees. So why would he show restraint specifically when it came to the most humiliating detail of all, if it had actually happened? Modern historians have looked at this gap and drawn a pretty reasonable conclusion. The Persian sources, despite obviously being one-sided propaganda themselves, actually present a far less sensational image of Valerian's captivity than the Roman Christian sources do. and there's other supporting evidence pointing the same direction. Some modern scholars, researchers specializing in Sasanian Persian history, argue that Shapur may have actually treated Valerian and at least some of his surviving soldiers with a degree of practical respect, relocating them to Persian cities like Bishapur or Gundashapur, where they apparently lived out years in conditions that were, relatively speaking, livable rather than tortuous. And here's a detail that should genuinely surprise you, because it flips the entire barbaric captors narrative on its head. Those captured Roman soldiers may not have spent their captivity in chains doing nothing. Some accounts suggest the Persians actually put Roman engineering expertise to productive use. There's a massive ancient dam near the city of Susa in Iran, sometimes called Caesar's Dam, that historians believe was built using the labor and engineering know-how of these captured Roman soldiers. If true, that's an almost unbelievable historical footnote. The same captivity that supposedly produced humanity's most infamous human footstool may have also produced a feat of civil engineering still partially visible in Iran today. So why does the footstool story exist at all, if it probably isn't literally true? A few layered explanations, and they're not mutually exclusive. Multiple things were probably happening at once. First, shame. The capture of a Roman emperor was such an unprecedented disaster that it demanded an explanation, and Roman writers needed somewhere to direct their anger and humiliation. Blaming it on barbaric, monstrous Persian cruelty was psychologically much easier for Roman readers to process than confronting uncomfortable truths, that Rome's own emperor had simply lost, fair and square, to a genuinely brilliant enemy commander. Second, religious narrative. As we discussed, Lactantius specifically needed Valerian's death to look like divine punishment for persecuting Christians. A boring captivity, ending in old age and comfortable exile, doesn't make that point nearly as well as molten gold and a skin trophy. Third, and this is a detail that often gets lost, there's a specific, almost folkloric storytelling tradition in the ancient Near East of depicting humiliated, fallen kings literally underfoot, beneath the conqueror's feet, or as a step beneath the throne. It shows up across multiple ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern cultures as a kind of universal symbol. This man's power has been completely inverted. What was once above is now beneath. It's entirely possible that this symbolic, almost ceremonial image of the defeated foe beneath my feet, calcified over generations of retelling into a literal, specific anecdote about a literal wooden step and a literal daily ritual. Historians call this kind of process a horror story, designed specifically to paint the enemy, in this case the Persians, as savage and barbaric in contrast to civilized Rome. To be completely fair to both sides of this debate, we have to acknowledge real uncertainty here too. We're relying on written accounts from decades after the events, by authors with agendas, on one side, and on monumental propaganda carved by the winning king specifically to celebrate his own greatness, on the other side. Shapur had zero incentive to carve an inscription admitting, "By the way, we treated this guy badly." And he had every incentive to carve something making himself look like a magnanimous, godlike conqueror who didn't even need to humiliate his fallen enemies because his victory spoke for itself. So the absence of a footstool carving doesn't prove gentle treatment beyond all doubt, and the presence of the footstool legend in Roman texts doesn't prove cruelty either. Historians, even today, openly admit they cannot reach a fully definitive conclusion about exactly what happened to Valerian in captivity, or precisely how he died. What we have is competing, biased narratives, and the genuine historical work is in understanding why each side told the story the way it did, not in pretending we know the unknowable for certain. What we can say with much higher confidence is this. The legend of the footstool tells us less about Shapur, and more about how badly Rome needed to process an unthinkable humiliation, and how useful that humiliation became, generations later, to a Christian writer settling theological scores with a dead persecutor. Whatever actually happened to Valerian personally, the political aftershocks of his capture were undeniably, catastrophically real, and this part of the story doesn't depend on which version of his death you believe. Picture the chain reaction. The reigning Roman emperor has just vanished into enemy captivity, with no army left in the region capable of rescuing him, and Persian forces now sitting in Roman territory with essentially nothing standing between them and even deeper conquest. This should have been an existential moment for the entire eastern half of the empire. And the official response from Rome, from Gallienus, Valerian's own son and co-emperor, was conspicuously absent. Outcome of the battle. So, in the end, what did Verdun actually achieve? The casualty figures alone are almost impossible to fully absorb. Estimates vary by source, but most serious historians place total casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, on both sides combined, somewhere between 700,000 and 950,000 men, across roughly 10 months of fighting, confined to an area of front only a few miles wide. To put that in perspective, across the full length of the battle, that works out to a rate of loss approaching 1 human casualty roughly every single minute, for 10 straight months, in a battle whose entire strategic purpose, on the German side, was never to seize any meaningful territory at all. Falkenhayn's cold mathematics of attrition, bleed France white while sparing German blood, failed, completely and catastrophically. France bled, horribly. But so did Germany, at almost the same rate. Neither side gained any lasting strategic advantage. The front line, when the dust finally settled, had moved almost nowhere at all. And yet, to call Verdun a battle fought for nothing, fundamentally misunderstands what it actually became, in the eyes of the men who fought it and the nation that watched from home. For France, Verdun stopped being merely a military campaign at some point during those 10 months and transformed into something closer to a national test of collective will. Pétain's words, "Ils ne passeront pas, they shall not pass," outlived the battle itself by decades, becoming one of the defining phrases of French national identity for the rest of the 20th century, echoed again with grim determination during the dark opening months of 1940, and remembered still, generation after generation, as a kind of national scripture. Pétain himself emerged from Verdun in 1916 as the single most celebrated general in all of France. A national hero whose reputation was built so powerfully on the defense of Verdun that it would, ironically and tragically, eventually help carry him to power under circumstances far darker and more compromised than anything he faced in 1916, as head of the collaborationist Vichy regime during the Second World War. And for the ordinary soldiers themselves, French and German alike, Verdun became something close to mythical, even within their own lifetimes. Veterans who had survived the battle were regarded differently by other soldiers of the war, even hardened men from other brutal fronts. They had endured something that even seasoned veterans of the Somme or Ypres looked upon with a kind of horrified, reverent awe. Today, the battlefield still bears the scars, more than a century later. The towering Dôme d'Ossuaire, completed in the 1930s, stands watch over the old front line, containing the mingled, unidentified remains of an estimated 130,000 soldiers, French and German both, mixed together in death in a way either side's army would ever have permit. In 1492, when Columbus stepped onto a beach in the Bahamas, he believed he had found nothing. Empty land. Wild forests. This is not the story of a new world. This is the story of a world that was already old. Our story doesn't start in 1492. It starts at least 15,000 years earlier, and maybe much longer ago than that. During the last ice age, sea levels dropped so low that a strip of land, scientists call it Beringia, connected Siberia to Alaska. For generations, small bands of hunter-gatherers crossed it, chasing mammoths, bison, and caribou into a continent no human had ever seen. For decades, this Clovis first theory was the accepted story, that the earliest Americans arrived around 13,000 years ago. But the evidence has been rewriting itself. Fossilized footprints found at White Sands, New Mexico, suggest people were walking those salt flats over 20,000 years ago. Sites in Chile, Texas, and even Pennsylvania hint at human presence even earlier. The truth is, we don't have a clean starting date. What we have is proof that humans adapted to nearly every environment on the continent: tundra, desert, rainforest, mountain, and they did it with extraordinary speed. By 11,000 years ago, descendants of these first migrants had reached the southern tip of South America. 12,000 miles of new land, settled in a geological blink. Long before anyone built a pyramid in Egypt's Old Kingdom, something extraordinary was happening in what is now Louisiana. Around 3500 BC, hunter-gatherers at a site called Watson Brake built 11 earthen mounds arranged in a circle, without farming, without metal tools, without the wheel. This wasn't supposed to be possible according to old theories of how civilizations form. Complex societies were supposed to need agriculture first. Watson Brake broke that rule by thousands of years. Later, around 1700 BC, an even larger complex rose nearby, Poverty Point. Its earthworks required moving an estimated 750,000 cubic meters of soil, basket by basket, without a single draft animal. And these people weren't isolated. Artifacts found at Poverty Point came from 1,000 miles away: copper from the Great Lakes, stone from the Ozarks. A trade network was already alive in North America 4,000 years ago. This was just the beginning. If you'd stood on the Mississippi River near modern-day St. Louis in the year 1100 CE, you would not have found wilderness. You would have found one of the largest cities on Earth. Cahokia. At its height, it was home to an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 people, larger than London at the time. Let's bring this all the way back down to solid ground and separate what we can say with real confidence from what remains permanently, frustratingly uncertain. Here is what we know for certain. Valerian became Roman emperor in 253 AD during one of the most chaotic periods in the empire's entire history. He fought a genuinely formidable Persian king named Shapur I, who had already humiliated 2 previous Roman emperors before him. In 260 AD, at the Battle of Edessa, weakened critically by an unrelated plague outbreak, Valerian's forces were decisively defeated, and he became the first Roman emperor in history to be captured alive by a foreign power. He never returned to Rome and never regained his freedom. He died in Persian captivity. Here is what remains genuinely, permanently disputed. Whether he was tortured and ritually humiliated as a literal human footstool, or whether he was relocated to a Persian city and allowed to live out his remaining years in relative, practical comfort. Whether he died a violent, gruesome execution by molten gold or flaying, or whether he simply died of old age, far from home, a captive but not necessarily a tortured one. Whether his skin really did end up stuffed and displayed in a Persian temple as the ultimate trophy of conquest, or whether that detail was invented or exaggerated generations later by a Christian writer who had every reason in the world to want Valerian's death to look as monstrous as possible. What we can say with confidence is this: the surviving Persian rock carvings, commissioned by the very king who supposedly orchestrated all of this cruelty, shows something noticeably less sensational than the Roman literary tradition does. That gap between the two surviving sources, stone built to last forever versus text written decades after the fact by an author with an explicit agenda, is exactly where the genuine historical mystery lies, and it's exactly why historians still can't give you a single clean, definitive answer today. So the next time you hear someone state with total confidence that a Roman emperor was literally used as a human footstool, and trust us, you will hear it stated with total confidence, because it makes for one unbelievable headline. You'll know there's a great deal more going on underneath that story. A defeated empire trying to process an unthinkable humiliation. A persecuted religious minority looking for proof that justice eventually comes for tyrants. And a Persian king who, if his own monuments are anything close to reliable, may have settled for a far quieter, but ultimately no less devastating, form of victory, simply showing the world that he had captured a Roman emperor at all, and didn't need a footstool to prove it. If you found this kind of deep dive into the gap between legend and evidence interesting, that's exactly the kind of history we love covering on this channel. Not just the viral headline, but the real, messy, contested story sitting right underneath it. Let us know in the comments which version you find more convincing, and which ancient rulers, too good to be true, story you want us to dig into next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.